Welcome to Lecture 4A, and today we're going to start thinking about how organisms, in this case different photosynthetic organisms, are able to deal with the stresses that winter can present. And we're going to start off with a bit of a botany primer. And if botany is something that you're interested in, remember here at Providence, we offer a botany course, study of plants, and I think it's on about a 2-year rotation, so I believe we'll be teaching it next year. Well, hopefully this equation here and this term photosynthesis isn't brand new to you. Maybe you just need your memory jogged a bit in terms of what the equation looks like. But photosynthesis, it's really important to think about this when we start our discussion on botany, the study of things that can photosynthesize. And what does it involve? Well, photo refers to light, right? If you're taking a photograph, you need light. A photon, this is this particle or wave-like characteristic of light. So photo means light, synthesis means to make something. So if we put those two together, photosynthesis, you're making something and you're using light, in this case, light energy from the sun to drive this reaction. And maybe you recall from chemistry that you've taken, on this side of this arrow, we have our reactants, and on the other side of the arrow, we have our products. So in photosynthesis, our reactants are carbon dioxide. This is an inorganic form of carbon, something our bodies can't use. We breathe it in and out, but we can't access this carbon in this state. It's in an inorganic state. We have to acquire our carbon from an organic, in an organic form, like glucose. So in this reaction, this photosynthetic reaction, we have carbon dioxide plus H2O. Hey, we remember what that is. That's water, right? We remember that water is a polar molecule. It has a slightly positive side where those little Mickey Mouse ears were, the hydrogen side, and a slightly negative side where the oxygen is. And maybe we recall things like hydrogen bonding and all that. So here we have our two reactants, and in the presence of sunlight, as well as what this arrow doesn't show, chlorophyll or some kind of photosynthetic pigment, we're able to capture, not we, but in this reaction, capture this light, this energy from the light. And look at this now. We take this carbon, and the equation is balanced. So we have 6 carbons over here. We got 6 carbons over on the product side, and we produce this molecule called glucose. This is now an organic form of carbon, and it's a form of carbon that our bodies can access and use. And another product of the photosynthetic reaction is oxygen. And this is why, if you have house plants or plants in your office, sometimes people say it helps to freshen the air because you're adding oxygen to that through photosynthesis. Well, I can see here I've got photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So let's take a look at this other very important biological reaction called cellular respiration. So I'm showing you this. We now can see if I'm moving in this direction, it's photosynthesis. I recognize the reactants and the products, and I see that it needs light energy, and it's green. The arrow, they made it green because it's representing photosynthetic pigments, chlorophyll. But if I go in the opposite direction, in this direction, so now these are my reactants, and the reaction is going in this direction, and these are my products, I can see that this is labeled cellular respiration. So this occurs in cells, and this is how our cells, along with cells in plants and other living things, acquire their energy. And I see that here, chemical energy and some heat. Okay, so what's happening in respiration? You burn stuff, you burn things. So you're burning, in this case, you're burning glucose. And you know from, maybe you were at an Advent service this past Advent season and they're lighting the Advent calendars. And then maybe after the service is over, instead of blowing them out, maybe the church had like a candle cover. I'm not sure what they're called, but a little cup that you put over the candle and the candle goes out. Why? Well, you're snuffing it out. You are limiting its oxygen supply. And once that candle has used up, and that flame has used up all the oxygen in that little, underneath that little cup, it goes out. So just like burning a candle requires oxygen, or maybe you're having a campfire, and we'll have some chances at site to have some campfires. That you can blow on it. You're adding that oxygen you're adding in your breath helps maybe drive that fire. Okay. In this reaction, cellular respiration, though, you need the oxygen in order to break up or burn, in quotation marks, the glucose. And in that process, you release the energy that's tied up in these bonds in the glucose. You break apart this organic form of sugar, and look at that, you produce carbon dioxide, and in your bodies, you breathe that out. It's a waste product of cellular respiration, and water. So these two reactions, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, are really important. You can and do undergo cellular respiration all the time. That's where your body's getting its energy from. And where does that energy ultimately come from? Well, it comes from the sun. And that energy from the sun was captured not by you. You can't photosynthesize, but plants and algae can. And they turn that carbon dioxide, they capture that energy from the sun, and they combine it with some hydrogen and oxygen from water, and they produce glucose, and that energy from the sun is now stored in the bonds. And when your body burns or breaks those bonds in the glucose, you release that energy. When you burn wood in your fireplace, you release that energy. And really important to keep these things in mind when we're talking about ecology, when we're talking about botany. So your body does this. Sometimes we forget that plants do this as well. So plants aren't just photosynthesizing for the fun of it, but they're doing this because they too rely on this organic form of carbon for their energy, and they access that through cellular respiration. Again, that's just a quick overview of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. If you're interested in those processes, you could take a biochemistry class. I believe also in Intro to Biology in those first year courses, you cover photosynthesis and cellular respiration in much more detail. And again, if you took a botany class, you would visit photosynthesis in much more detail. Okay, well, we're still on this botany primer, and we have something here called a food web. And this is a food web that you might see in the boreal shield ecozone. And so I can see that I've got a lot of things that probably look green here, right? Grass, trees, lichen, shrubs. But I only have one wolf. Well, what's happening? Well, okay. I guess we're looking at the transfer of energy within an ecosystem. In this case, we're looking at the boreal shield ecozone. And we can see that the base of the food web, it includes things that can photosynthesize. And we're going to call these photoautotrophs. So auto means it does it by itself. Troph means to feed. Photo means light. So these things can use light and they're self-feeders, as opposed to like a caribou. Can't produce its own food. It is a heterotroph. Okay. So here we have these things that can photosynthesize, and they capture that energy from the sun and store it in that organic forms of carbon. And this caribou eats it. We'll look at its main source of food, our common name, the reindeer lichen. You know, caribou and reindeer. We have caribou are native to Canada. Reindeer are native to places like countries in Scandinavia, places like Finland, for instance. But we can we can have another conversation maybe about reindeer and caribou for now. But we'll be looking at reindeer lichen as an important food source for caribou, and they eat this and they can access the energy from the sun that has been stored through photosynthesis in the bonds in the glucose. Okay, so energy transfer in this direction, and then maybe the wolf is accessing that energy by eating the caribou, or maybe it accesses its energy from eating the moose or this deer. But ultimately, that energy comes from sunlight. Okay, so that's important to realize or to remember when we're thinking about ecology, winter ecology. Well, we're going to spend some time looking at different groups of photosynthetic organisms, and um, I've got the word taxonomy here. This is just a fancy way of saying how we organize things. And you know, we have different ways of organizing things. Maybe you're a collector and you collect, maybe you collect records, music records, or maybe you collect comic books, trading cards, and you might have different ways of organizing those. And scientists too, we have different ways that we use to organize life forms. So we can group them into things that photosynthesize and things that don't photosynthesize, and things that photosynthesize, then we can group in different ways. If you're interested in taxonomy, you could take, especially of photosynthetic organisms, you could take a course in botany. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time defining these groups, but I just wanted to show you some examples or give you a quick overview of these groups that I'll be using in this lecture, and then we're going to see how they deal with the stresses of winter. So the first group here I've got are algae, and you know, here at Providence, this term, winter 2025, we're offering a course on the biology of algae. It's called phycology, and maybe some of you are in that class, but if you're not and you're interested in taking the course, I believe it's on about a 2-year rotation as well. So what are algae? Well, they can photosynthesize. They differ from true plants, and again, I'm not going to get into all the ways that they differ, but in the area that we're interested in, where the field station is, the algae we'll be looking at is found in aquatic environments, and it tends to be microalgae. So if we would go to the coast and maybe took a course in marine biology or marine ecology, then we would have that opportunity to encounter macroalgae. Maybe you've seen big kelp, for instance, big macroscopic seaweeds. Maybe that's the term you're familiar with. But here we see a picture of a bunch of smaller filamentous algae, and we're mostly going to find, even though these things are algae are the most probably the most significant photosynthetic organisms on Earth due to their sheer number, volume, and the amount of photosynthesis that they undergo. Okay, well, if we think about algae, especially in the area where we will have our field stations or field study, we also want to think about lichen. And lichen is this close relationship between algae and fungus. What is fungi or funga? What are examples of fungi? Well, maybe you have eaten some recently on your pizza if you had a mushroom pizza. Um, So there's there's a whole study on fungi. Think about mycology, for instance. That would be the study of things like mushrooms. But this lichen, and we see it here on a rock, and we'll probably see some of it if we scrape away the snow on some of the rock outcroppings at the site. It's this close relationship between between algae and fungi, and they live together, and they both benefit from the relationship. So it's a mutualistic relationship. The algae get a nice supportive structure to grow in, and the fungi get nutrients coming from the algae that can photosynthesize. If we think about lichen, we mentioned that reindeer lichen, common name, reindeer lichen, and here's a picture of it. This is a really important food source in the wintertime for caribou, especially barren lands caribou if we go up to northern Manitoba. Okay, so we've looked at some algae and also algae within lichen. And now we're going to talk about or look at moss. And I have this term here, non-vascular plants. So now we're talking about plants, true plants. And I think most of us have probably seen moss before. I think we talked about sphagnum moss earlier in earlier lectures in this course. This is not sphagnum moss. This is moss, another species of moss. I see it's growing on maybe that same rock because I can see some lichen, that rock in that earlier picture. I see some lichens here. But here we got moss, and it's a non-vascular plant. That means it doesn't have vascular tissues. And again, a course in botany would expand upon what vascular and non-vascular plants are. But vascular tissues are tissues that transport either photosynthetic products, like that glucose, like that sugar we looked at, that product of photosynthesis, or they might be vascular tissue that transports water. Well, moss does not have vascular tissue, and we'll look at how moss is able to withstand winter conditions later in this class. Okay, well, most of the plants that we'll encounter in the at the field station probably are going to fall under vascular plants. Plants that have vascular tissue, they have tissues, xylem and phloem. Xylem transports water and dissolved minerals, and phloem transports photosynthetic products or food, you can think of it, for the plant. And under this category of vascular plants, we can break it down into non-woody and woody plants. And under non-woody plants, we can divide that further and use these terms that maybe you've heard of, especially if you're a gardener, such as annuals, biennials, and perennials. So non-woody versus woody, well, it's pretty self-explanatory. Non-woody plants don't form this secondary growth, this woody secondary growth. So they don't have a lot of substance called lignin that creates that structure that we know of, or that we call wood. So their stems are going to be a lot softer than something down here in the woody section. And under here we have annuals, like this type of sunflower, wild sunflower. Annuals within one season germinate, grow, produce seed, and die within one season. That's why we think of it every year that happens, and we'll talk more about annuals later today. Then we have biannuals, and maybe you've ridden a bicycle lately, so you know that bicycle you rode had two wheels. So if we use this term biannual, these plants require 2 years to complete their life cycle. And here, maybe you have some of this plant on your yard. I know we have it on our campus at Otterburn. It's a common name for it is burdock. Maybe call it a burr. But this is a biannual, so it takes 2 years to complete its life cycle. In that first year, it produces this rosette. So you see these massive leaves, and it grows near the ground. And then in the second year of growth, it produces seeds, and those are what we know that are really super sticky, right? The original Velcro. You walk by this in the fall, and your shirt or hoodie is going to be covered in these seeds because they've stuck to you. That's the strategy they're using for seed dispersal. All right, so under non-woody, we also have perennials, and maybe you think of that term perennial, like they're always a perennial contender. What does that mean? That means year after year, this sports team is always in contention for the championship, I guess. The Winnipeg Blue Bombers seem to have been perennial contenders for quite some time, even though they haven't always won the championship. Okay, well, with perennials, then they come back year after year, more than just 2 years in a row. And a great example, and one we might see evidence of at the field station, is Canada goldenrod. And this is it in the summertime, and then it's going to, the above ground portion of it is going to die off, and then next year it'll grow up again from nutrients it's stored over winter in its taproot. And we'll talk more about this strategy later today. And then we get into woody plants, and we'll probably also interchange woody with trees usually, and we can have deciduous trees. These are trees that are going to lose their leaves in the fall, and they spend the winter without leaves, and in the spring the leaves come back again. And we want to remember, well, I think we know what most deciduous trees look like, but we want to remember that the tamarack, otherwise known as the larch, also does this. So it has needles for leaves, but in the fall it loses them, and it spends the winter without any leaves on it. So here's a picture. You might walk through this forest, and maybe we'll have a chance to see some tamaracks at the field station, and you might say, "Oh, looks like these trees are all dead," when in fact they're just a deciduous tree that has, well, if they're a tree that's lost their needles, and that's a strategy that they employ to prevent water loss, for instance, over the winter. Then we have non-deciduous evergreens. So as the name implies, these are green year-round, and so I think we'll have an opportunity to see a number of evergreens at the field station. Okay, so that was a bit of a botany primer. If this primes your interest in this discipline, perhaps you want to sign up for the botany course in semesters to come. But for now, we're going to switch over to thinking about winter stress. And humans can get that SAD disorder or condition, seasonal. I can't remember what it stands for, but I know that it's you're seasonally depressed in the wintertime. You can be due to maybe lack of light, natural light. And so there's public spaces, sometimes like libraries, for instance, that have lights that you can go and sit under, and perhaps that can help. Well, we're not talking about looking at stress in humans right now in the wintertime, but we're looking at stress to photosynthetic organisms. And cold probably comes to mind. And it's interesting looking at the temperatures that can have negative effects on different types of photosynthetic organisms can really vary from species to species, and it depends on what conditions they have evolved to that they've evolved to live in. So in this document here, describes how if some tropical plants can start to show signs of injury in temperatures as warm as 15 degrees Celsius, because for them, that's cold. That's a cold presents a cold stress. Whereas we might have some photosynthetic organisms like some algae from really cold environments like the Antarctic Ocean, that start to show heat stress signs in temperatures just above 5 degrees. Okay, well, we'll look at temperature stress in more detail later in later lectures. But for now, we're going to think about the other stress that's presented that is there in the wintertime, and that's drying out or desiccation or lack of sufficient amounts of water. So plants can lose more water than they absorb. And we see that in these evergreen trees here that aren't looking so green at the tops, perhaps due to insufficient amounts of water. And perhaps that's because they are losing more water than they're able to absorb. So if we think about winter stress, that stress of cold temperatures and that stress of desiccation, and we think about woody plants, so trees, we find there can be a tree line both as you move up in altitude, let's say on a mountain, or up in or down, or increases in latitude on a global scale. So first, this picture here, we can see as you move up the mountains, you get to a point where there are no trees. And it's interesting, if you look at sort of the ecosystems when you move up a mountain, they parallel those ecosystems that you see when you increase latitude. So when you move either further north, those are northern latitudes, or those extreme southern latitudes, you get kind of that same transition in ecosystems as you move up. So you can have alpine, which refers to mountains, alpine tundra ecosystems, just like you can have that tundra ecosystem when you move up into those northern latitudes. So here we're looking at tree line. So above that, temperature and soil, and the soils that are present, often related to the temperature, are such that no trees are able to grow. And we see that, here we have a map. You can orientate yourself based on things like Lake Winnipeg and Lake Manitoba, and you are, Providence is about right where my cursor or the pointer is right now. So this figure, the document I took this figure from, was looking at the present day tree line, which is roughly here in the red. So if you move further north beyond this tree line, you don't see trees. And they're talking about how with climate change, that the projected tree line based on those models is going to be much further north than the current tree line. And why is that? Well, it has to do with a changing climate and less stress for those trees in a warmer climate scenario. Okay, well, let's look at some strategies now that these different photosynthetic groups of organisms may have to deal with the stresses of cold and desiccation. And the first group we'll look at are the algae. And, we actually have a type of algae, common name for it is watermelon snow, that grows in the snow. And, when we were talking about transmission and reflection of light energy in the last lecture, we were talking about how it relates to snow. And we talked about how snow is a great reflector. But as snow ages, its reflective abilities are decreased. And I'm not sure if I introduced the word albedo in that class, in that lecture, but albedo, albedo is a measure of how good the snow is at reflecting or absorbing light energy or radiant energy. And we can see that, if we had things in here like dust and dirt or red algae or this red pigmented algae, we can really reduce the reflective ability of the snow. So now when this radiation from the sun hits the snow surface, it's going to have less of it being reflected and more of it being absorbed. And if more of it is absorbed, then your snow is going to melt quicker. And we're seeing that with kind of this vicious cycle with climate change. And let's say we've got a year of a lot of forest fires and all that ash, fine particles in the air. When that settles on something like a glacier, it really can reduce the amount of light or sun energy that's being reflected, and you can have increased melt of this permanent snow. Well, that is similar to these increases in watermelon snow. And anyway, that's a type of algae. It grows quite well right in the snow. Now, I don't think we'll see any watermelon algae at site, but at our field station that we're going to be using, but we might have access to, or when we drill through the water, through the ice, I should say, and do some water samplings, perhaps we'll see some blue-green algae that overwinter by developing these really sturdy cells called aconites. And again, if this kind of stuff interests you, we'll be exploring it in much more detail in that phycology class. It's a course on the biology of the algae. So here we have this filamentous algae. These are the vegetative cells, and we've got a couple of types of specialized cells. Something called a heterocyst here, and just briefly, these heterocysts are able to capture nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix it. So pretty important for the well-being of this algae. But we also see these kind of barrel-like cells, and look how much thicker or darker the outer part of that cell is, and that allows them to overwinter. And that's one way that algae in the water in a winter setting in the boreal can survive the winter. Another way that some algae are able to survive the winter is that they can regulate their buoyancy. So going back to this slide we've had before, when we were looking at ice formation and the turnover and development of these strata, these thermal stratifications, we see that in the wintertime. Some types of algae are able to regulate their position in the water column, and they do that by regulating the amount of gas that they have. So perhaps they're up here during certain times of the day. If it's too bright, some species can actually see reduced photosynthesis if the light is too intense, and so they might regulate their position and sink a little lower in the water column. This can also be beneficial to them in the wintertime, because if you look at the temperatures here, we know that water is most dense at 4 degrees Celsius, and so these algae, maybe they sink, regulate their buoyancy, pardon me, and sink a little further in the system during the wintertime, and then are exposed to warmer warmer water in the hypolimnion, in this frozen lake setting. Okay, well, let's switch over to looking at some lichens and moss and their strategy here. A great picture of this caribou digging in the snow, trying to access that reindeer lichen, that food source. And caribou, barren ground caribou in Manitoba, the herds that we have here, they have really large migration routes. In the summertime, they're up in Nunavut in the calving grounds, and the wintertime they come further south to areas where maybe the snow cover isn't as great, and they can dig and access this lichen, and that's where they overwinter. And if you look at some communities, I was talking about Lac Brochet. That's that community that is connected only by winter roads. But they're at the kind of that southern tip of the winter migration extent of the Barren Grounds caribou. And so in the wintertime, these caribou move south and are close to these communities that use the caribou and rely on the caribou for their livelihoods. Okay, well, we're talking about the lichen here and moss. You remember the moss don't have vascular tissue, and they aren't really able to regulate their water content. Same thing with the algae in the lichen, and so these groups of photosynthetic organisms, you can think of them as kind of just going dormant. They turn off under these dry, cold conditions that the winter presents, and that's how they overwinter. And then in the springtime, the snow melts, it warms up, they have the moisture and the heat, and they turn back on again and photosynthesize. Well, let's think about how annual plants deal with the winter conditions. And remember, annual plants germinate, flower, set seed, and die all in one season. And it's this seed that allows them to overwinter. And here's a picture of these. This is another type of burr. This is not the common burdock. This is like cocklebur. Maybe that's a common name. These things are really sharp. I took this picture along the Red River, and if you're walking with your dogs and they encounter these, oh, they're terrible to get in their feet, and they're very sharp. But I like this picture because, here we've got this plant in this seed. It's cozy. It can survive the winter in the seed, and then in the summertime, in the springtime, when conditions are right, it can germinate, grow, flower, set seed, and then die again. And that's how it continues. And seeds, again, getting back to basic botany, a seed has these three main components. A seed coat, that's what allows them to overwinter. And a food source, that's going to be important for this little growing embryo once the seed germinates. Okay, so that's how annual plants are able to survive the winter. If we think about biennials, these plants that live for 2 years or need 2 years to complete their life cycle, in that first year, so remember, I don't know if you can see it here in this picture, but I showed you an actual picture earlier of this rosette. So this is the first year of growth, and then when fall comes on and the top portion dies out, before that happens, they transfer all the nutrients into this taproot. And then in the spring of the second year, the plant uses the nutrients that in the springtime that are found in this taproot to grow and continue in that second year of growth. And then in the second year of growth, it produces seeds, and the seeds then can grow new plants in the following year. Okay, well, let's move on to perennials. This is maybe not quite as bright of a picture of the goldenrod that I showed you earlier with the nice yellow when it was in the summertime in full bloom. This is what you're going to see maybe at the site in the wintertime. And this perennial, each season it grows, and then it dies back. The above ground portion dies off. But before it does, just like with that biannual, it transports a lot of the nutrients into the below ground components like taproots or rhizomes. And then in the springtime, new above ground portions of the plant will grow. We want to recognize that this thing also has seeds, and that's how it can reproduce. But this individual plant will grow again next year from the nutrients it has stored in the taproot, which survives the winter in a dormant state underground. I've also put in the term here rhizomes, because this is another way that some perennials, like cattail, and I've showed this picture before, we'll have an opportunity to see the above ground dead portions of cattail at site, but rhizomes, so in the wintertime, in the fall time, these plants start to translocate nutrients into the below ground portions of their bodies, called rhizomes, and then those rhizomes live throughout the winter. They're in dormant state underground or under the sediments, and then in the springtime they grow from back up to the above ground portion from nutrients stored in those rhizomes. And this translocation of nutrients is one of the reasons, something I'm interested in is studying how cattail can be used to purify water. And so we have examples, like maybe some of you have visited the treatment wetland in St. Pierre-Joly. La Broquerie also has one of these these treatment wetlands, and basically they're a big wetland that is just composed in terms of its biodiversity, very low biodiversity, just has cattail, because cattail are really good at removing nutrients from the water. And so some people suggest that you can then burn off or cut the cattail, and you can remove those nutrients. And that's true, you can remove some, but the best time to cut these things is in the winter time, when you can access them. And remember, where are most of the nutrients? Most of the nutrients have moved to the below ground portion by winter time. And so while you can remove these easier in the winter, you're not going to be removing a lot of nutrients from the system, because where are those nutrients? They're here in these rhizomes, these below ground portions. And this is a nice shot. You can actually eat these rhizomes, but this is a great shot because you can see the new cattail above ground portion growing at the tips of these rhizomes. Well, hopefully you've got from today's lecture a bit of an understanding of the different types of photosynthetic organisms that we have. And we've looked at the winter strategies of some. Like in this picture, we can see some annuals, some grasses here that are dead now, and they're overwintering. Most of these now are overwintering in their seed, and remember what a seed is. And maybe also in this picture you can see in the background some trees. And next lecture we'll be talking about how woody plants, such as this deciduous tree, what their strategies are for dealing with the stresses, those cold and desiccating conditions that we see in the wintertime. Okay, thank you. See you in lecture 4B.